Can your three-season gear survive winter conditions, or do you need to make some changes? And what kind of changes can you make to your gear so that when you do go out on a winter backpacking and camping trip, that you have the best experience possible? And it starts with your big four gear items and the layers that you wear on your body as well to protect you when you're out in those cold temperatures. Which, speaking of, I want to thank Thermore for sponsoring this video today. Thermore makes synthetic insulation. We'll talk about it a little bit more here in a minute when we start talking about layers and how you choose good layers for your winter trips. Now, even though it's the end of October right now, it is a beautiful 70-degree fall day here in Utah, and it feels like winter's never gonna show up, but it is just around the corner. The snow is on the way. There are some things to take into consideration and account for when planning your gear. And when you think about like, what is the weather and conditions gonna be like in the summer versus what it's going to be like in the winter, it changes pretty drastically. And so you're planning your gear around those things. But those considerations are, what's the anticipated weather? What is the ambient temperature going to be like? The high for the day, the low for the day, how does that change my gear planning and such? But then also, what is the ground temperature going to be like? Am I sleeping on snow? Am I sleeping on frozen ground? Or is it pretty mild where I'm at and I don't have to worry about really cold ground? Because that changes things quite a bit with your sleep system. But then what other factors there might be of the opportunity for you to get wet. In the winter, I feel like there is an increased opportunity for you to get wet from sweating, but also external factors. So we're going to talk all about that today. Let's first talk about backpacks, because your backpack is pretty critical to your experience in the sense that I need to consider whether or not my three-season or my smaller pack that I use for the warm months of the year is going to be sufficient to carry everything that I need for the trip that I'm going on. In most cases, it probably is going to be big enough to handle an increased amount of bulk from your sleeping bag, from extra layers and that kind of thing, and it all works out just fine, and it's not too heavy on your back, because we're also not typically walking super far into the backcountry in the winter. So overloading my pack just a little bit is not necessarily a big deal. But if you do find yourself in really extreme conditions, maybe going with a much larger backpack. So this is a Hyperlight 55-liter backpack here. This is a 70-liter pack from Superior Wilderness Designs. This pack is also rated to carry 50, 60 pounds of gear comfortably. I would never want to carry that much, but this is something to keep in mind as an option if I need a really robust winter backpacking setup. Then maybe I'd need a pack that can carry that much more bulk and weight so that I enjoy myself that much more. Just something to think about to make sure that you have the right pack to carry the stuff that you're taking with you. Now, the big game for me with winter backpacking and camping is just staying dry and warm. Most of the time we are hiking in and we're putting on all of these layers and we end up sweating way more than we should. And once we start sweating and having issues with water that way on our body, it makes it hard and difficult for us to stay warm, because now we've got a chill, we've got wet, damp clothes, and that promotes an opportunity for dangerous situations like hypothermia and just getting that chill and just not enjoying yourself. So the layers that you take on a trip are so important to your experience. And what I will do before I go on a trip is I will research and study the forecast and see what things are going to be like for the area that I'm going to. And I primarily also pay attention to, is it going to snow? Is there going to be freezing rain? What is the humidity level going to be like? Because that will also determine the layers that I choose to take with me. Specifically, do I take for my insulation layer like this one here that I'm wearing, do I take down or do I take synthetic insulation? Now, for the most part, everybody understands the big differences between down insulation and synthetic insulation. Down, when it gets wet, does not allow for it to insulate properly. It clumps up and that becomes a problem. And it's also really hard to dry. Synthetic insulation does do a fairly good job when it gets wet to continue to insulate, but it also dries quicker than down is going to. And that's where I want to talk about today's video sponsor, which is ThermOR. ThermOR makes synthetic insulations. It's inside of this carbon jacket that I'm wearing here. And in fact, the insulation that's in this is an EcoDown fiber, which is a loose fill synthetic insulation that's also resistant to clumping, and when it gets wet, it's not going to break down and have issues that way. It's a very effective synthetic insulation for an active and damp and wet kind of situation that you might find yourself in. Now, ThermOR has been making synthetic insulations for a very, very long time, since like 1972, and they specialize in making recycled insulations as well from PET or plastic bottles. It's very likely that the insulation that's inside of this jacket here came from a bottle that was floating around in the ocean at one point, and now it's in my jacket, providing me warmth and that opportunity to enjoy myself when I'm out. That is really, really cool. So what does it mean though to put together a really robust or effective layering system? The first thing that it starts with is a good base layer. I personally prefer base layers that are either a synthetic wool or a full polyester, which means that it's going to promote the opportunity to wick moisture away from your body, but it will dry quickly. That is the most important thing, is fabrics and materials that are going to dry quickly. Then second is having good mid layers. Very often in the winter, we are layering up more because it's cold. And then what that promotes is for our body to overheat and get sweaty and such. So I want a mid layer that is going to keep me warm, but it's also going to dry quickly and be able to promote some airflow and that kind of air movement through my layer. So these are a couple of mid layers that I really enjoy. This one from Outdoor Research right here is a grid fleece type of fabric that is very warm, but when I am moving in it as well, then I'm also able to allow for some breathability and such. And same with this Outdoor Vitals mid layer that I've got here. What I do see happen kind of frequently is I'll just take a lightweight puffy jacket and I'll be able to hike in that. Like this pinion down jacket that I've got from Stio, this I would not call a winter down jacket. Now, I could layer this with multiple down jackets, but it's pretty thin and it has sewn through baffling, and it's just not going to be as warm as another option. And so this is not necessarily going to be the best choice for me for a deep winter setting, but it could be something that I take multiple layers of to be able to give me the insulation that I want. Or I can take something that has just a higher volume, more loft of insulation, like this one from Carbon here that is that synthetic fill insulation. But again, the conversation comes down to, is it going to be a dry cold or a really humid cold? If it is going to be wet, then I will almost always choose a synthetic option because I want to protect my gear. I want to protect my layers from getting wet. And that will happen from, like I said, the sweating aspect of your movement and such when you're on a trip, but also just from it being humid and the snow. Like sometimes it's a little bit warmer during the day, the snow melts, it creates more moisture opportunity, especially around your tent, and then you get condensation more so inside of your tent than you would in other kinds of settings, and then it rubs off onto your gear and it becomes a problem that way. So there's just a lot of opportunities for you to get wet that maybe you didn't think about ahead of time, and having the right layers to make it possible for you to enjoy yourself is really, really important, and keep yourself protected. Nobody wants to get hypothermic, nobody wants to get wet, And so your layering makes a big difference in that opportunity. The last layer for you to consider, and that you probably should have with you on any kind of winter trip, is some kind of rain and hard shell for you to wear that will break the cold wind that is blowing in the area, but also be able to give you a waterproof layer to protect your other layers to keep you dry. That is super, super important. Now, one of the most critical things to plan for a winter backpacking or camping trip is to get a comfortable, warm, enjoyable night of sleep. That is something that is so important. Regardless of the season, if we don't sleep well, then we are not happy the next day. We just don't enjoy ourselves as much. And so, particularly in the winter, you truly want to make sure that you are warm and cozy and just have an awesome night of sleep. Now, here in front of me, I've got my 3-season quilt. This is the UGQ Bandit top quilt that's rated for 20 degrees. Now, 20 degrees is the standard, I feel like, that most of us are carrying out on our 3-season backpacking trips from late spring through the summer to early fall, and that is plenty of warmth for us to get that enjoyable night of sleep. Now, the Bandit top quilt here in front of me happens to be comfort rated to 20 degrees, but keep in mind it is a 2-part system. We'll talk about sleeping pads here next. But most of the time, a sleeping bag or a quilt is going to be survival rated or cold rated, meaning if it says 20 degrees, it is going to be cold at 20 degrees. And the comfort rating is usually 10 to 12 or so degrees warmer than that. So 20 degree survival rating equals a 30 degree comfort rating, unless the company says specifically that it is comfort rated like you get from UGQ. But if I take this out on a winter trip and it gets down into the 20s, I'm dealing with also humidity from the cold and wind and such. It's probably just not going to be enough for me to have that warm experience of sleep that I want to have. Now, do I need to purchase a really robust, heavyweight, super warm sleeping bag for me to enjoy myself? Not necessarily. That can be a lot of money to invest. So there are ways for you to increase the warmth of your sleeping bag or your quilt without having to spend a ton of money. The first is to get one of those Sea to Summit bag liners that increases the warmth of your bag, and it adds an additional layer to the inside, but there are a couple other options as well. One of my favorites is also from UGQ. This is the Quillo. This is a pillow, but it also acts as a ultralight blanket and quilt, basically. So this is the junior size, and this will go out into a blanket. I can also get a larger size that I think they call the deluxe, but I have a little foot pocket here, and I can take this down insulated, like 50 degree rated quilt and line the inside of my backpacking quilt here. And I've now just added that much more insulation to the loft and such of my quilt to make it sleep that much warmer. That is a simple way for you to add some additional warmth to your 3-season setup to make it so that you're not spending a huge amount of money, but allowing yourself to get down to those much lower temperatures. Now, if you do find yourself wanting to get out on many winter cold weather backpacking trips where you're gonna be experiencing some pretty hefty cold temperatures, I do suggest at that point to get a winter sleeping bag quilt setup. Now, investing into a full winter sleeping bag or quilt is important if you are going to be out in really cold temperatures. What I showed as a hack of adding some layer to your 3-season bag is a nice addition if you are not going to be in really cold temperatures. You want to sleep warm. You want to take care of yourself in those conditions, and so getting something that is winter rated for those 0 degree Fahrenheit temperatures or colder is important. So what I've got here in front of me is a -5-degree rated Zenbivy light bed. This has an amazing amount of down insulation inside of it. It is designed to be comfort rated at 5 degrees Fahrenheit with an R7, R value rated of 7 sleeping pad underneath. That ensures that you are going to be quite toasty down to some pretty cold temperatures out in the backcountry. But you can just see how fluffy and lofty this quilt is from Zenbivy, and it just makes for a really cozy way to sleep. And I think that's important. Getting good sleep equals a more enjoyable time in the backcountry. But that is just one piece of the puzzle. Let's talk about sleeping pads and the importance of them as a full system here, because that changes so much to your experience as well. Now, arguably for me, one of the most important, if not the most important piece of gear for your winter backpacking gear setup is a very warm sleeping pad. Yes, it is important to have a warm sleeping bag or quilt as well. That is one part of the puzzle, part two being your sleeping pad. But this is what provides you that protection from the cold ground just sucking the heat away from your body and making it so that you have a miserable night of sleep. I've spent many nights on the snow sleeping on just frozen ground and such, and had the pad not insulate me properly, and then I in turn have a bad night of sleep, and I don't want others to have that as well. So even though there is a standard testing ASTM rating that can be done and is done on sleeping pads now to determine the R value of the pad, it is not 100% accurate in telling you exactly how that pad is going to perform. I have spent many nights on an R value of 4 and higher sleeping pad, the Big Agnes Zoom you well, and had really cold nights of sleep. Just has not performed the way that it should. And an R value of 4 should keep you plenty warm down to freezing temperatures and being on pretty cold ground. And that's not always the case. The way that a sleeping pad is constructed plays a huge role in the ability for it to insulate and provide that warmth opportunity. Do look at how a pad is being used out in the real world, what the reviews are saying, before you just look at an R value and say, yeah, that says an R value of 8. I'm gonna sleep super warm, and then you end up not having a good night of sleep. That can absolutely happen. So do look for people who are using the pad out in the conditions that you would be experiencing and see what it is going to do for you. But maybe you don't want to invest into a cold weather sleeping pad. You still want to use your 3-season pad. It's at roughly an R value of 3 to maybe 5, like this Tensor Trail from Nemo, which is just under an R value of 3. How can I take something like this and then enjoy a warm night of sleep and not have to worry about the cold just being sucked out from me through that conduction that you get from sleeping on the cold ground? Well, that comes from adding supplemental insulation to the pad in the form of a closed cell foam pad like this one, the Switchback from Nemo, but there are many other options that you can choose from as well. So I take this and I place it on the underside of my pad here. And what that does is it creates a thermal barrier. It creates a spot for the cold to just be pushed back down to the ground. Now, I know people in the comments are going to say you can't push cold down, but you get the idea. It's just creating a barrier so that the conduction is significantly less and that cold ground is not essentially sucking that warmth from your body. Ooh, a little potato bug. So that's one way that you can do that, but you can also add additional layers on top of the pad in the form of like fabric or other things that don't have a compression to them that would add that thermal insulation value and create that barrier even more for you to sleep warm. But in the same sense of if you are going to be spending a lot of time out in the snow specifically, I feel like getting a dedicated cold weather sleeping pad is the way to go. This is the Xped Ultra 7R. This has an R value of 7. It uses their down mat insulation technology on the inside. This is a phenomenal cold weather sleeping pad. I sleep very warm on this pad, even without having to use a closed cell foam pad underneath. This thing is awesome. The Neo Air X-Therm from Thermarest is a tried and true, just proven pad to also use for those winter conditions. That is going to guarantee that you enjoy yourself even more when you're sleeping on the snow, on really cold, frozen ground and such, paired with a really good sleeping bag or a quilt. That is the two-part puzzle, and it makes such a difference in your experience when you are out on a winter trip. So now obviously what we've talked about today is just some of the considerations for winter backpacking. You also have like cooking gear, you have your stoves that you would take, footwear, and other things that are important to your experience out on a winter backpacking trip. These, however, I feel like are the most critical, the most important things to consider and look out for or pay attention to when planning your gear for a winter backpacking trip. But obviously, having good footwear, good socks, pair of pants, other base layers and such are important. A stove system that is going to function well in cold weather conditions is also important to think about, as well as other things. If you have questions about it, let me know down in the comments section. But thanks for watching today, guys. I hope you found some value out of this whole discussion. And I also want to thank Thermore for sponsoring this video today. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please do subscribe. Have an awesome day, guys. We'll see you on the next one.